Hey guys and gals, Vlad here with AVT-Astro, and today, as always, I've got an interesting Astro topic for you guys. For those of you that might not be familiar, I learned a little Astro blog called AVT-Astro.com, and of course this YouTube channel, so if you're not subscribed, please do consider subscribing. Over the years, I've had the privilege of owning over 100 scopes, more accessories than I can count. And this is one of the scopes here. This is not a huge water heater. This is a 24-inch Dobsonian telescope. As the title implies, we are talking about going big in aperture. Alright, so just in case you haven't watched my channel, I'll just kind of go over a brief history of, me going through the different sizes of telescopes. Basically, I've had scopes, up to 12 inches pretty much my whole life, since I was like about 20 or so. I got my first 16-inch scope, which, I'd consider a pretty large scope already. Certainly qualifies as a, like a larger Dob. When I was about, I think I was about 27 or 28. And really that was a really good size. I had several 18-inch scopes after that. My dream always was to get a 20-inch plus telescope. I was fortunate enough to pick up this guy, which is a Spica Eye telescope. That's an f3.1 24-incher, and I just really wanted to share my experiences. I purposely did not make this video kind of shortly after I got the telescope. I've had the telescope for over a year because I really wanted to use it so that I could give you guys my honest feedback on how it is to own one of these, as far as what it is to it involves to haul it around. And just what can you expect to see out of an instrument that's this large essentially. Alrighty, so in the interest of not making this video 14 hours long, I am going to give you a very brief overview of the basically the specs and the capabilities of this telescope. So essentially, like I said before, it's a 24-inch f3.1, which is fairly darn fast by even by today's standards. Mirror on this thing. It's made by equatorial platforms. These are about as premium as it gets. It's got a feather tight focuser. It even has a capability to do a dew heater for your eyepiece and stuff. There's a dew heater on the secondary mirror. The scope is fully GOTO, so it's got the Nexus DSC that you can kind of control it with. I actually don't really use this guy past the alignment phase. I actually use my tablet. This is a 12-inch Android to control the whole scope with Sky Safari. Very, very cool. There's actually a wireless remote control that comes with it that allows you to kind of adjust where the scope is pointed, so that's really cool. Another really cool feature of the GOTO system that's on here, it's actually a slip clutch design, so I could actually have the scope fully aligned, right, and I could be moving it and it still stays aligned, so I could actually change where it's pointing to manually. So that's a really neat kind of function of this overall scope, and I'll just kind of walk around just to kind of give you more of a view of what this thing looks like. Alright, so overall, how is it to own a larger Dob? I'll start, without going this big, I'll start with the 16-inch Dob. So my first, larger scope, like I said, that I got, when I was pretty young, was a 16-inch light bridge, mid light bridge that is. The thing broke down fairly small. I actually transported it all the time in the back of a four-door Honda Civic. So, if you were after a larger scope, they could be very manageable. Now, when I upgraded actually, to an 18-inch Dob, which was essentially an Obsession clone, I did actually have to buy a trailer just to transport it easily, because you can't really pick up the rocker box with the mirror in there, even of an 18-inch scope. And that's very true about going in larger than that. Like this thing, I still have a trailer that I transport this thing in. It does have the wheels, and obviously these guys, they do come off when you're actually using the scope. I just kind of wheeled it out, just kind of show it to you guys in the video here. Wheelbarrow handles, these things are an absolute must. And again, these do kind of pop out. But overall, by the time you break this thing down, because this is a thrust tube design, right? So these poles, they kind of come off. The secondary cage comes off there. It's actually, you know, you'd be surprised. It's really not all that hard to load this thing up, especially if you have a trailer with like a drop gate, essentially, a drop gate ramp. I mean, I could load this thing up by myself very, very easily. I mean, there's really, you know, not too much about it. Now, obviously, that's assuming that you have a trailer, or, you know, you'd for sure need like a truck or a large SUV to transport this. I mean, you're not going to transport this in the Honda Civic. So the lifestyle changes for, you know, a scope of this size are certainly there, especially if you don't have the vehicles for that, or like a trailer or something to haul it around. You know, obviously, you know, as you saw me in the beginning of the video when I was standing by the scope, I mean, it's large, right? So normally it sits in like this area of my garage, so it takes up, you know, a fairly decent kind of chunk of my garage real estate too. So overall, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the lifestyle changes, you know, are kind of there when you go this big with the scope, you know, from both, you know, just storing and hauling it around. But really, I'd say that after you kind of get the hang of it, it's really probably not as bad as you'd figure, you know, essentially. All right, I had to power up with the coffee. Now, again, continuing on with the video. So speaking of lifestyle changes, you know, one thing that I did want to point out just kind of right off the bat is when you go with the larger telescope, you know, that's even like, let's say even a 16-inch, you really start to notice, you know, when you start to use it, that the larger the scope that you have, the more important it is to have a pristine sky. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I take this scope, right, which is, you know, a fairly large scope, we rolled it out, you know, outside in the light polluted sky, and we put like, you know, a familiar CA by it, you'd actually be surprised at how little of a difference, you know, having a larger aperture is, unless you have pristine sky conditions. So you will have to make the adjustment if you go with the larger scope to taking the thing out to darker skies unless you live in them. Sky transparency is also very important, so yeah, you will need better skies. Like I'm kind of lucky, I live in a fairly dark sky site. It's actually one of the other reasons why it's worth it for me to own this thing, because you know, I could actually just roll this thing right out the garage doors there. I do live in a subdivision, so there is a lot of local light pollution, but that's why I made these, you know, like kind of panels to block, you know, straight light and that type of deal. I've got a video on that, so if you're curious, check it out. So anyway, but yeah, you will have to make that lifestyle change to actually take this thing out to the dark skies. And one other thing that I wanted to point out about the like a lifestyle change that you will have to make if you know, if you go with the larger scope, is when you actually get out to dark skies, you know, so let's say if you're at a star party, you become that guy. You're like, wait a second, what do you mean that guy? Well, you become that guy with the big telescope, right? And for some people, you know, it's probably a really, you know, positive thing. For some people, it'd be like a really negative thing, you know. And basically, what I mean by that is, you know, when you, like, you know, take this to a star party, you set the thing up, okay. It's like taking out a neutron star, okay? It's gonna draw people to it, okay? The gravity of a big scope is there, okay? It's a true phenomenon. So, yeah, you're gonna have people, way more people coming up to, you know, like asking for a look, or just, you know, in general asking about the scope. So again, you know, some people would really enjoy that, you know, they'd like really love the attention. Some people, you know, like if you're kind of more introverted, you might not like that. But it is, you know, something that you kind of have to get adjusted to. Like, I honestly don't really care if people come up, you know, and want to take a look. I'm more than happy to show them a look through the scope or tell them about the scope. But, you know, honestly, if nobody came up to me, I'm also fine with that. So, you know, I'm kind of neutral to it, you know, personally. All right, so let's get to the meat of the, you know, of the video basically, and that is, you know, what are the views like, you know, through a scope that's, you know, larger like that. I'll kind of go through a couple of different things. I'm going to compare this, you know, to the views that you get through from smaller scopes, let's say from like 5 inches to 12 inches. Then I'll compare it to like, you know, larger scope, you know, let's say that's like 18 or 16 to 18 inch, and then I'll actually compare it a little bit to EVA as well. So let's start with the smaller scopes. I'm not going to lie, just as you would expect, if I have this thing set up, you know, we're going to talk about setting this up in the dark sky because that's where it really needs to be used. Okay, if it's under light pollution, like I said, it's a little bit different. We're talking about dark skies for, you know, all the comparisons. If we have this set up, let's say to like a familiar CA or even like a 12-inch Dob, anything that I have this pointed to will be a better image, right? Like, surprise, surprise. Okay, so that, like, honestly, I'm not gonna like elaborate too much on that. No matter what I have this pointed to, you know, as far as deep sky objects, I mean, it's gonna be brighter. It's gonna show you more detail, whether it's like a dim fuzzy, like a super dim galaxy, or like something like M42. This does show you a better image. Okay. So we'll just kind of get that out of the way. I mean, there's just really no way about it. This gathers way more light than, like, let's say a C8 or something like that. Now, when we start to compare it to something like a 16-inch Dob, that's where the, you know, kind of like comparisons, you know, kind of get a lot harder to do. You'd actually be surprised at how many objects, right? Especially if you're not like super, you know, like experienced in observing, that you'll have this thing pointed to in like a 16-inch Dob, and the view will be very, very similar. And when I say very, very similar, it's actually at low powers. Okay, so I'll give you guys, you know, this kind of quick story. Before I had this scope, I was at a star party. Where a club member had a 22-inch Dob, right? And you know, I knew that the scope was there, right? And I happened to have been looking at M51, the Whirlpool Galaxy, in my 16-inch Dob that I had at the time. So I was, you know, like I studied the galaxy for like, you know, like a good half hour probably before I went over and took a look through a scope, right? And I asked him to actually point it at M51, which, you know, like graciously he did, so that was really cool. And you know, like honestly, I was kind of, you know, shocked at how similar the view was. I mean, I would have figured that, you know, like everything just be brighter and better and that type of deal. But at first blush, like honestly, I didn't see very much difference. In fact, you know, I actually went back to my scope and I studied the galaxy more, and I went back to his scope. And actually, after scrutinizing the detail, I was able to see like all the little knots in the spiral arms, you know, way better through his scope. And just like really fine detail was better. But again, if I wasn't very experienced in observing, if I didn't spend the time, you know, kind of studying the two images, honestly, the view wasn't very, you know, different. Now, this is actually before I got my scope and I actually learned the true power of what makes these things greater, okay? And that is the ability to really, really crank up the power, okay? So, like, you know, how high of powers are we talking about? To me, typically when I'm observing with a refractor, right, anything that's over 200x is pretty high power. For this thing, it's barely scratching the surface, okay? So this thing, I'm able to crank it up to 400, 500, 600x on deep sky objects and still retain the, you know, the surface brightness of the object. And that's actually the true power of, you know, using one of these guys. So I'll start off, you know, like when I first bought this thing, it was kind of like late winter of last year. I'll start off talking about M42. You know, most people have seen that object, you know, Orion Nebula. So basically, the first time I kind of pointed this out here, the sky conditions weren't that great. The transparency wasn't that great. And again, with the scope of this, you know, size, you do need really good transparency and really good sky darkness, okay? But so it wasn't ideal conditions. I pointed the scope at it, right, at low power. This is before I knew that you really needed to use these things at high power to really kind of unleash the potential. You know, I mean, the view was bright and it looked great, but it wasn't like, you know, like, I'll be honest with you guys, you know, that's the whole point of making this video, is to be honest, not just to praise the, you know, the thing. I wasn't like, my socks weren't like blowing off. I wasn't like, whoa, it's so great, you know. I mean, the view was bright, it was nice, but was it like dramatically different from what I've seen before in other scopes? No, not really. But what I learned the more that I used the scope, even on that night, is the higher the power that I went to, the more detail that I started to pull out. I mean, especially a bright object like the Greater Orion Nebula. I mean, when you're using, you know, like let's say 400x on the thing, it's kind of like almost like exploring the moon. Anywhere you point, you know, the field of view, because, you know, the field of view already gets pretty narrow, right? You see a huge amount of detail. There's just, you know, gradients of color variation everywhere. I mean, really, the best way that I'd summarize it is that it's like looking at a whole new object. I mean, the amount of detail is just amazing. A couple of things that I specifically noted about the Greater Orion Nebula. is that the amount of embedded stars that you see in the nebula through a larger scope like this, it's just crazy. I mean, I've never seen nearly so many stars, embedded in the nebulosity. Also, the nebula, this is kind of after studying for a little bit, it does take on a way more 3D effect because I think there's just a lot more greater color variations when you use a larger scope, and you can see color, like actual color, through a larger scope. I mean, you can even start to see it with the 16s, but certainly with this thing. So in Orion, I see a lot of greens, I see pinks, I see some yellows. So yeah, you do start to see color in the brighter deep sky objects with this thing. Okay, so kind of sticking to the comparison of like the 16-inch to the 24. Another, kind of pair of objects that are really interesting to, kind of like compare. M81 and M82 are two galaxies in Ursa Major. Basically, one of them is called a cigar galaxy. The other one, I don't know if it has a common name. But anyway, it's a face-on spiral galaxy. And those are two really interesting objects. I mean, they're right by each other. You can see them both in the same field of view at low power. At low power, honestly, they don't look substantially different through this thing compared to like a 16-inch, right? Now, when you crank up the power, especially on the cigar galaxy, this thing shows you way more mottling and just kind of like, detail in the, and just the overall spiral structure of the cigar galaxy. So again, once I crank this baby up to like 500x, I mean, it's kind of interesting because those objects that you're familiar with seeing, I mean, they literally, the best way that I could describe it, they look like a whole new object because you could spend like a good hour studying each object. I mean, there's that much detail to be seen at high power on these objects. And trust me, once you see it, it's just something that, like, again, it just looks like a whole new object. Now, going back to M82, the other galaxy that's right by it. So that's an interesting one because, that galaxy is fairly large, right? And it's very low surface detail. The spiral arms are, they're pretty hard to make out pretty much in any scope. And actually, interestingly enough, like this thing doesn't really do, too much more justice to it. I mean, the spiral arms are a little bit more pronounced with the scope compared to like a 16-inch, but the difference isn't really huge. So again, the object, that you're observing could vary, if you see more detail or significantly more anyway, through a larger scope compared to a more moderate scope. All right, and so the last example that I'll give you guys, as far as comparing, like a common object that a lot of people have seen, with the 16 to the 24-inch, is M57, the Orion Nebula. So when I had this out at the star party last year at Jansen Ranch, me and our VP of observing were kind of like checking out quite a few objects through the scope. But we specifically kind of like, zeroed in on M57 because the transparency wasn't that great last time, but M57 was right above, so it was pretty, pretty decent there. Anyway, so I've seen the central star in M57 before. This thing pulls it in, not surprisingly, the easiest of any scope that I've seen in it. Like on that night, again, the transparency wasn't that great. I don't think the scene was that awesome. I picked it up pretty quickly. Matt, our VP of observing, he took a little bit longer to pick it up, but he picked it up as well. There's also a really dim galaxy, I think it's like 15th magnitude or something, that's right by the Orion Nebula. That was kind of like our challenge object for the night. That one I actually have never seen. I don't know if I've ever looked for it before. But it was a lot of fun, chasing it down with, the big scope. And that was actually one, really cool thing about having the big scope is that pretty much anything that you see in the star atlas, chances are you can see through the, through the scope. I mean, it might be hard to find like that galaxy. It did take us some time to kind of, just really kind of see where it was in relation to the stars. But I picked it up and then he picked it up. So it was, it was a good time. And for really dim stuff like that, having the extra aperture does really help. All right, so now get into EAA. If you're not familiar, EAA is electronically assisted astronomy, to where you use a camera instead of, like an eyepiece to look at objects. I've got videos on it. If you're curious, check it out. But anyway, does this thing compare to like, let's say I'm even gonna use, I usually do EAA on a 12-inch SCT, but we'll even compare it to a more moderate setup that a lot of people, have probably had experience with if you've done EAA, which is like a C8 with the camera attached to it. I'm not gonna like lie or sugarcoat or anything like that. Pretty much anything that you do with the EAA, even on a C8, will be in better detail with more color and that type of deal compared to even the 24-inch Dob. So if you're, if you do EAA and if you're okay not looking through an eyepiece, you're already seeing more detail. So like by going with the larger scope, you're really not gaining anything. Now, of course, the view is kind of different. Like I enjoy doing both of them, but it's not really the same experience. I mean, looking through an actual eyepiece is a totally different experience than looking at a screen. I won't get into the topic, but to just kind of sum it up, EAA does show you for sure more than even like a larger Dob like this. Alright guys, so hopefully you guys found this information interesting. If you're considering, going with the larger scope, or if you're just kind of curious, what all the coupes that have them, how it is to yeah, that's kind of like the info that I, kind of had for you guys. If you guys have any questions, comments, or anything like that, by all means, leave them in the comments below. If you're actually considering a larger scope, just want to ask, somebody that already owns one, feel free to shoot me an email. I'll be happy to answer it, to the best of my abilities. Anyhow, if you guys are not subscribed, please do consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.